A single crack in the foundations of faith is not merely a personal tragedy. It is a geological event, a seismic rupture that travels through the bedrock of certainty upon which entire worlds are built. And when that crack appears in the soul of a space marine, in the heart of one who was made to be unbreakable, it spreads like a fracture through ceramite, like corruption through consecrated ground, until even the stars themselves seem to dim in recognition that something holy has been broken beyond any prayer's power to mend. I was there the day my faith died. My name is Meridius, formerly Brother Sergeant Meridius of the Crimson Castellans, 3rd Company, bearer of the Aquila Triumphant and the Oath of Eternal Vigilance, veteran of 173 campaigns across 47 systems, slayer of enemies beyond counting, servant of the Emperor for 214 years of subjective time, longer by far if measured in warp translation and the strange elasticity of time that accompanies void warfare. I have spoken the liturgies of battle so many times they have become my heartbeat. I have knelt before chapter masters and chaplains and received their blessings and their commands with equal reverence. I have killed in the Emperor's name with joy, with pride, with absolute certainty that each life I took was a prayer offered up to the Golden Throne. Each world I burned was a candle lit in his eternal vigil. I believed. Emperor, help me. I believed with a purity that lesser men could never comprehend, with a faith so total it had no room for question, no space for doubt, no crack through which uncertainty might enter. But before the numbers, before the designation and the holy oils and the incense smoke that cannot mask the smell of opened flesh, before all of that, I was something else. Someone else. A man who walked the lower hive levels of Tertius Majoris beneath skies I never saw, through corridors of corrugated steel where rust bloomed like flowers and the condensation dripped eternal tears from overhead pipes thick as a man's torso. I worked the manufactory lines on Sublevel 93, where we assembled las-gun power packs for the endless war effort, where the shift bells rang their brazen songs at intervals measured not in hours but in eternities of repetitive motion. I remember the heat. Emperor, preserve me. I remember the heat of those manufactories, the way it pressed down like a physical thing, like the hand of some vast and indifferent god pushing us into the earth. We worked in our undergarments, skin slick with sweat and chemical runoff, and still men collapsed daily, dragged away by the medicae servitors to be processed. Recycled, we called it, though we tried not to think about what that meant. The air tasted of ozone and burning insulation and human desperation, and we breathed it for 16 hours at a stretch, our lungs slowly converting to something like leather, our throats raw from the fumes. I had friends then. I remember fragments of them, ghosts that flicker through my degraded memory cores like saints in a cathedral window, beautiful and untouchable. There was a woman. Her face is mostly gone now, replaced by a blur of warm colors and the ghost of a smile, who worked 3 stations down from mine. She used to hum, low and tuneless, a habit that annoyed everyone around her except me. I found it comforting, that small defiance against the mechanical rhythm of the line, that insistence on organic irregularity in a place designed to erase such things. I think I loved her. I think her name was gone. Another piece dissolved into the chemical bath of neural reformation. There was also an older man, weathered and bent like a tree grown in toxic soil, who had worked the lines for 40 years. 40 years. He told me once, with something like pride, that he had assembled over 2 million power packs with his own hands, that his contribution to the Emperor's war machine was written in the small acts of 10,000 days. His hands shook with tremors that worsened each year, his fingers crooked and scarred from 1,000 small burns and cuts. But he worked with a precision born of absolute familiarity, his movements economical and sure. I wanted to be like him, I think. I wanted to last, to endure, to become part of the great machine through sheer persistence. I did not understand then that the machine does not care for endurance. The machine wants efficiency, and when flesh becomes inefficient, the machine knows how to improve it. My crime was small, pathetically small. I stole 3 ration bars from the distribution center, not for myself, though I told myself this lie for a long time afterwards, but for the woman who hummed while she worked. She had mentioned, casually, that her younger brother was sick, that children in the lower habs had started wasting away from some new deficiency disease that the Medicaid crews ignored, and I had wanted to help. Such a small thing, such a tiny gesture of human kindness in a universe that has forgotten what kindness means. 3 ration bars, each no bigger than my palm, wrapped in wax paper and stamped with the Aquila, and I slipped them into my overalls with hands that trembled not from palsy, but from fear. They caught me at the checkpoint, leaving the distribution level. I do not know how they knew. Perhaps there were augur arrays I had not seen. Perhaps some other desperate soul had informed on me to earn favor. Perhaps the Omnissiah himself, in his infinite calculation, had designated this moment for my unraveling. The Arbites were waiting, 2 of them, massive in their carapace armor, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors that reflected my own terrified expression back at me in duplicate. They did not speak. They did not need to. One grabbed my arm with a grip like a hydraulic clamp, and I heard something crack. A bone, I think, some small bone in my wrist. And then I was dragged backward through the checkpoint, while crowds of workers parted around us like water around stone, their eyes carefully averted, because to witness is to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in the lower hive means death or worse. The Arbites' precinct house was a fortress of gray rockcrete and harsh white lumens, every surface smooth and cleanable, designed to be hosed down regularly to remove whatever residue the work of Imperial justice left behind. They threw me into a holding cell with a dozen others, and we huddled there in the chemical stink of fierce sweat and recycled air, not speaking, not meeting each other's eyes, each of us alone with the knowledge of what we had done and what would be done to us in return. Some wept, some prayed, whispering the catechisms we had learned as children, begging the Emperor for intercession that would never come. One man, young, perhaps 20 standard years, with the soft hands of a data clerk, laughed, a high broken sound like crystal shattering. He laughed until the guards came and beat him silent with shock mauls, and then he simply stared at the ceiling, blood running from his split lips, his eyes empty of everything except the understanding that hope was a luxury none of us could afford. They caught me at the checkpoint leaving the distribution level. I do not know how they knew. Perhaps there were augur arrays I had not seen. Perhaps some other desperate soul had informed on me to earn favor. Perhaps the Omnissiah himself, in his infinite calculation, had designated this moment for my unraveling. The Arbites were waiting, 2 of them, massive in their carapace armor, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors that reflected my own terrified expression back at me in duplicate. They did not speak. They did not need to. One grabbed my arm with a grip like a hydraulic clamp, and I heard something crack. A bone, I think, some small bone in my wrist. And then I was dragged backward through the checkpoint, while crowds of workers parted around us like water around stone, their eyes carefully averted because to witness is to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in the lower hive means death or worse. The Arbites' precinct house was a fortress of gray rockcrete and harsh white lumens, every surface smooth and cleanable, designed to be hosed down regularly to remove whatever residue the work of Imperial justice left behind. They threw me into a holding cell with a dozen others, and we huddled there in the chemical stink of fierce sweat and recycled air, not speaking, not meeting each other's eyes, each of us alone with the knowledge of what we had done and what would be done to us in return. Some wept, some prayed, whispering the catechisms we had learned as children, begging the Emperor for intercession that would never come. One man, young, perhaps 20 standard years, with the soft hands of a data clerk, laughed, a high, broken sound like crystal shattering. He laughed until the guards came and beat him silent with shock mauls, and then he simply stared at the ceiling, blood running from his split lips, his eyes empty of everything except the understanding that hope was a luxury none of us could afford. The tribunal lasted 7 minutes. I know this because there was a chronometer on the wall behind the judge's bench, its hands moving with the inexorable precision of imperial timekeeping, measuring out the moments of my dissolution with mechanical indifference. The judge was not human, or was no longer entirely human, his face a silver mask of augmetic perfection, his eyes replaced by multi-spectrum optical arrays that glowed with a dim red light. He spoke in a voice that came from somewhere behind his teeth, synthesized and cold, reading charges from a data slate held by a servo skull that orbited his head like a mechanical moon. Theft of Imperial resources, disruption of supply chains ordained by the Administratum, violation of the sacred trust of logistical providence. Each charge fell like a hammer blow, and I tried to speak, to explain, to offer some defense, but my advocate, a tired woman in rumpled robes who had 12 other cases to process that shift, simply shook her head minutely, warning me to silence. It would not matter. It never mattered. The machinery of imperial justice moved according to formulae written 10,000 years ago, and individual circumstance was just noise in the signal, irrelevant data to be filtered out in service of aggregate efficiency. The sentence is servitorization, the judge said, and the words hung in the recycled air like a prophecy, like a curse, like the pronouncement of a fate worse than any death. The guilty party will be remanded to Mechanicus custody for processing and subsequent reassignment to duties befitting their new station. In this way, their crime will be redeemed through eternal service to the Omnissiah and the God Emperor of mankind. Let the record show that mercy has been granted. Where death might have claimed a soul, transformation offers only the purity of function. Mercy, they called it mercy. And I suppose in the cold arithmetic of the Imperium, it was, I would not be mulched for corpse starch, would not be rendered down to component chemicals, would not be simply erased from the records as though I had never existed. I would serve, I would work. My body would continue to contribute to the great engine of humanity's survival, even as everything that made me human was systematically destroyed. They loaded us onto a bulk transport that same cycle, 17 condemned souls shackled together in the cargo bay, our wrists bound with magna cuffs that bit into flesh with mechanical consistency. The transport's engines thrummed through the deck plating, a vibration that resonated in my bones, and as we lifted away from the precinct house, I caught one last glimpse through a reinforced viewport of the hive levels stretching away into the industrial murk, layer upon layer of human habitation stacked toward a sky I had never seen, all of it bathed in the orange glow of foundry fires and the pallid white of work lumens. It was ugly, it was horrible, it was home, and I would never see it again. The journey to the Mechanicus foundry complex took 6 hours. I know this because I counted my heartbeats, clinging to that organic rhythm like a drowning man clings to flotsam, trying to hold on to the evidence of my own biological existence while I still could. Around me, my fellow condemned reacted in different ways. Some prayed continuously, their lips moving in soundless catechisms, invoking saints whose names they barely knew. Some went catatonic, retreating into some inner sanctuary of the mind where the future could not reach them. One woman, skeletal and gray, tried to strangle herself with her restraints, twisting and pulling until blood ran down her arms. But the magna cuffs had proximity sensors that shocked her into unconsciousness before she could complete the act. They did not want us damaged. We were resources now, inventory to be processed, and inventory must arrive at the warehouse in usable condition. The foundry complex announced itself first through smell, the acrid reek of industrial chemistry, the sweet, corrupt stench of promethium, the metallic tang of fresh-cut steel, and the strange, organic undertone of something else. Something I could not identify, but that made my hindbrain scream warnings my rational mind could not articulate. Then through sound, the rhythmic pounding of forge hammers, the hiss of hydraulics, the whine of plasma cutters, and beneath it all, a low chanting in binaric cant, the tech priests singing their devotions to the machine god in a language that was not meant for unaugmented human ears. Finally, through sight, as the transport's rear ramp lowered, and we were herded out into a receiving bay, vast as a cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows and incense smoke, its walls lined with alcoves where half-finished servitors stood in various states of assembly, their exposed mechanisms glinting in the red work lights like the viscera of enormous mechanical beasts. They processed us with the efficiency of an automated assembly line. We were stripped of our clothing, cataloged, scanned with auger arrays that mapped every dimension of our bodies and assessed the quality of our component materials. I stood naked and shivering in a line of equally naked humanity, and tech priests in crimson robes moved among us like priests of some ancient sacrificial cult. their mechadendrites probing and measuring, their optical sensors dilating and contracting as they calculated our worth in the cold mathematics of the Omnissiah. Some of us they marked for heavy labor, the largest, strongest specimens, their muscle mass suitable for industrial servitor conversion. Others for delicate work, those with good fine motor control, steady hands, intact neural pathways suitable for precision tasks. Still others for combat servitor processing, their aggression indices high enough, their pain tolerance is sufficient, their capacity for violence measurable by whatever dark instruments the Mechanicus employed. I was marked for standard labor conversion. A tech priest whose face was more metal than flesh looked at me with eyes that clicked and whirred as they focused, and made a notation on a data slate held by one of his servo arms. Adequate musculature, sufficient cognitive baseline, moderate neuroplasticity index, standard configuration, multi-purpose labor designation. His voice came through a vox grill in his throat, stripped of all inflection, and he spoke of me the way one might speak of a piece of lumber, assessing its grain and potential uses. Then he moved on, and I was simply one more unit in the processing queue, my humanity already fading in the eyes of those who would remake me, their mechadendrites probing and measuring, their optical sensors dilating and contracting as they calculated our worth in the cold mathematics of the Omnissiah. Some of us they marked for heavy labor, the largest, strongest specimens, their muscle mass suitable for industrial servitor conversion. Others for delicate work, those with good fine motor control, steady hands, intact neural pathways suitable for precision tasks. Still others for combat servitor processing, their aggression indices high enough, their pain tolerances sufficient, their capacity for violence measurable by whatever dark instruments the Mechanicus employed. I was marked for standard labor conversion. A tech priest whose face was more metal than flesh looked at me with eyes that clicked and whirred as they focused, and made a notation on a data slate held by one of his servo arms. Adequate musculature, sufficient cognitive baseline, moderate neuroplasticity index, standard configuration, multi-purpose labor designation. His voice came through a vox grill in his throat, stripped of all inflection, and he spoke of me the way one might speak of a piece of lumber, assessing its grain and potential uses. Then he moved on, and I was simply one more unit in the processing queue, my humanity already fading in the eyes of those who would remake me. They held us in pens for the 2 days it took to prepare the operating theaters. Pens, there is no other word for them, though the Mechanicus would call them pre-conversion holding facilities in their reports. We were packed 50 to a room, given thin gruel to eat and tepid water to drink, forbidden to speak by armed servitors that patrolled the corridors outside, their weapons tracking any sound above a whisper with the patient inevitability of automated defense systems. I spent those 2 days sitting against a wall, my knees drawn up to my chest, trying to remember everything I could about my life before this moment. I found that memory was already becoming slippery, greased by fear and the growing certainty of annihilation. Faces blurred, names escaped me. Events that I thought were seared into my consciousness proved to be written in water, dissolving even as I tried to grasp them. There was only one memory I could hold clearly, and I clutched it with desperate intensity. The woman who hummed at the manufactory line, the one I had stolen for, turning toward me once with a smile that transformed her tired face into something luminous, something almost holy in its simple warmth. And I had felt in that moment a connection to another human being that transcended the grinding misery of hive existence. A moment of pure recognition that said we are not just meat to be processed, we are souls, we matter, we are alive. I wrapped that memory around myself like armor, swearing to whatever gods might still listen that I would hold on to it, that they could take everything else but not that last proof that I had been capable of love, that I had been something more than components awaiting assembly. I was wrong, of course. They could take that too. They would take that too. They would take everything, and I would be powerless to stop them. The operating theater was a cathedral of chrome and ceramite, its walls lined with surgical equipment that gleamed under harsh white lumens like instruments of divine torture. They strapped me to a surgical table that adjusted itself to my body's contours with disturbing intimacy, restraints emerging from hidden sockets to lock around my limbs, my torso, my head, holding me absolutely immobile, while servo arms descended from overhead gantries like the legs of some enormous mechanical spider. A tech priest in robes so dark with oil they looked black stood at the head of the table, his hands, or what remained of his hands, now mostly augmetic claws and precision instruments, poised above my skull, and he began to chant in a mixture of low Gothic and binaric that made my ears ache with its alien cadences. In the name of the Omnissiah, we sanctify this flesh. In the name of the machine god, we purge the weakness of independent thought. By the sacred protocols of servitor conversion, we transform this failed unit into holy machinery that it might serve the Imperium Eternal. I tried to speak, to beg, to plead for mercy I knew would not come, but my vocal cords were already paralyzed by neural inhibitors injected into my spine, and all I could manage was a thin, whistling wheeze that might have been a scream in some other lifetime. The tech priest ignored it. To him, I was already dead, or had never truly been alive, just an arrangement of biological components that had briefly possessed the illusion of autonomy, now being corrected to a more efficient configuration. The first surgery removed my left arm at the shoulder. I felt it. They had not anesthetized me, or had not anesthetized me sufficiently, because pain was just another data point to be recorded and analyzed. And perhaps because pain helped to burn away the personality, to shock the psyche into a more malleable state. I felt the laser scalpel part skin and muscle, felt the moment when the blade reached bone and the frequency shifted to cut through calcium and marrow, felt the terrible absence as servos lifted the severed limb away and deposited it in a disposal chute, where it vanished with a wet sound that I can still hear in the quiet moments between commands. Then came the replacement, a heavy industrial manipulator of pitted steel, bolted directly to my shoulder socket with mag clamps that fused to my remaining bone, neural interfaces threaded through my flesh like worms burrowing toward my spine, connecting my nervous system to servo motors and hydraulic actuators through adapter ports that burned with infection heat, even as sacred unguents were applied to prevent sepsis. They worked without pause, without mercy, without anything resembling compassion. My right leg next, removed at mid-thigh and replaced with a piston-driven limb designed for stability rather than grace, for tireless repetition rather than the subtle biomechanics of human movement. Then came the neural surgery, and this was worse than the amputations, worse than anything I could have imagined, because this was where they reached inside my mind and began to dismantle who I was. The tech priest made an incision across my scalp from ear to ear, peeling back skin and tissue to expose the bone beneath, and then a circular saw, blessed and anointed with sacred oils that could not mask its fundamental brutality, cut into my skull with a sound like screaming metal. I could smell my own bone burning, could feel heat radiating through my head as the saw blade completed its circuit, and a section of my skull was lifted away like the lid of a jar, exposing the gray-pink wetness of my brain to the recycled air of the operating theater. Commencing neural editing, the tech priest announced to whatever audience of servitors and lesser acolytes attended him. Frontal lobe reduction to minimize decision-making capacity, hippocampal modification to disrupt long-term memory formation, insertion of command receptor nodes throughout the motor cortex, estimated personality retention post-procedure 7 to 12%. 7 to 12%. That was all they would leave me. All that would remain of a lifetime of experience, of hope, of love, of the small rebellions and private joys that made existence bearable. Just 7 to 12%, and even that only as an accidental byproduct of the conversion process, neurological noise too small to be worth completely excising. They lowered instruments into my brain, and I felt my thoughts beginning to fragment, to scatter like papers in a windstorm. The memory of the woman who hummed, I reached for it desperately, a drowning man's last grab for the surface, and for a moment I had it, could see her face clearly, could hear her voice saying my name, my real name, the one I was born with. But then the instruments did something deep in my temporal lobe, and the memory shattered like glass, reduced to disconnected sensory impressions that meant nothing, conveyed nothing, were nothing but random neural firing without context or significance. I screamed then, finally, though my paralyzed throat could produce only a thin mechanical whine like a broken servitor's vocalization unit failing. I screamed at the loss of that last piece of myself, the final proof that I had been human, had been capable of connection, had mattered to someone even briefly. And the tech priest simply made another notation on his data slate and continued his work, untroubled by my anguish, because to him it was just the sound of machinery being imperfectly calibrated, requiring no more emotional response than a squeaking door hinge or a grinding gear tooth. The surgery lasted 14 hours. I know this because some distant, degraded part of my cognitive function was still capable of reading the chronometer on the theater wall, watching the minutes accumulate into hours, into eternity, into a span of time that contained the death of everything I had been and the birth of something new, something holy in the eyes of the Omnissiah, something abhorrent to anything still capable of recognizing human suffering. When they finally sealed my skull with bonding cement and ceramic plating, when they lifted me from the surgical table and set me on my new legs to test their function, I no longer knew who I had been. The memories were mostly gone, burned away in the neural editing, and what remained was fragmentary, unreliable, disconnected from any coherent sense of self. I had a vague impression of a place of heat and noise, of forms that might have been people, of an emotion that might once have been called love, but these were just ghosts, just artifacts of defunct neural architecture, and they meant nothing to the thing I had become. I was Unit Servitor Theta 7739. My function was manual labor, industrial maintenance, cargo manipulation. I would obey all commands transmitted through the command receptor nodes implanted in my motor cortex. I would not question. I would not resist. I would not think beyond the immediate parameters of my assigned tasks. I was holy machinery in the service of the Omnissiah, and this was mercy, this was redemption, this was the transformation of sin into service. They put me to work immediately, because idle servitors are wasted resources, and waste is the greatest heresy the Mechanicus recognizes. My first assignment was in the lower foundries of the complex itself, hauling ingots of refined ore from cooling racks to transport pallets, a task requiring strength and endurance, but no initiative, no judgment, no humanity. I moved through the work in a fog of automatic compliance, my augmetic arm lifting weights that would have crushed my original limb, my piston leg driving me forward with mechanical consistency, and some small part of my fragmented consciousness observed all of this from a great distance, horror-struck and helpless. The awareness came and went in cycles. Sometimes I would work for hours, days perhaps. I had no reliable way to measure time anymore. In a state of complete automatism, my consciousness dimmed to near extinction, aware of my actions only in the most abstract sense, as one might be aware of one's heartbeat or breathing, autonomic functions beneath the threshold of thought. But then something would trigger a cascade in my damaged neurology, some stray signal finding its way through the tangled mess of organic and artificial systems, and I would suddenly snap into clarity, into full awareness of what I had become and what was being done to me. These moments of lucidity were agony beyond anything the physical surgeries had inflicted. To wake up mid-motion, to feel my body performing tasks I had not consciously chosen, to realize that my limbs were no longer mine to control, that I was a passenger in my own flesh, a consciousness trapped inside a mechanism that moved according to programming I could neither access nor override. This was a violation so profound that language had no adequate words for it. I would try to stop, to wrench control back from the command receptor nodes, to simply refuse the next command. And it was impossible, absolutely impossible, like trying to stop your heart through force of will or halt the digestion of food in your stomach through concentration. The commands came, and my body obeyed, and the most I could do was watch, screaming soundlessly in the cage of my own skull, while my augmetic arm reached and lifted and placed with the inexorable regularity of a machine that did not tire, did not question, did not stop. I remember less each day. This is perhaps the worst part. Not just that they took my memories at the beginning, during the conversion, but that the process continues, that my remaining fragments of humanity are slowly being worn away by the grinding routine of servitor existence. Each boot-up sequence seems to overwrite a little more of what remains. Each liturgy of activation scrubs another piece of personality from my degraded wetware, and I find myself grasping desperately at thoughts that slip away even as I try to form them, at emotions that fade before I can fully experience them, at the ghost of a name I once had that now exists only as a phonetic echo in circuits that are slowly, inexorably converting to pure mechanism. They transferred me to a different facility after what might have been months or years. Time had become meaningless, unmeasurable, just an endless sequence of work cycles broken by maintenance periods and recharging sequences. The new facility was an orbital station, and the transport up from the planet's surface was the first time I had ever left the gravity well of my birth, though I could not properly appreciate the experience. The view through the transport's viewports should have been magnificent, the planet curving away beneath us, the stars appearing in their billions against the absolute black of space, the grandeur of the Imperium's void works spread across the orbital lanes. But the command protocols suppressed my capacity for wonder, for aesthetic appreciation, for anything that did not directly serve my function. I saw it. I processed the visual data, but I felt nothing, or almost nothing, just a distant echo of what awe might have been if I had still possessed the neurological architecture to support such emotions. The orbital station was a processing facility for void ships, and my assignment was to the external maintenance crews. They equipped me with a mag harness and void seals, crude augmetic modifications that allowed my body to survive in vacuum, and sent me out onto the hulls of Imperial vessels to perform repairs that were too dangerous or too tedious for human workers. Out there, clinging to the ceramite skin of battlecruisers and transport haulers while the void stretched infinite and terrible in all directions, I experienced a strange kind of peace. The absolute silence, the absence of other voices and commands beyond the minimal task instructions fed directly to my neural implants, the vast emptiness that seemed almost to welcome me. It was as close to freedom as I would ever know again. But even that peace was violated when the clarity came, when some glitch in my wetware allowed fuller consciousness to surface. I would be halfway through replacing a damaged hull plate, my augmetic arm wielding a plasma torch with mechanical precision, and suddenly I would truly see where I was, truly understand the incomprehensible scale of the vessel I was repairing. The billions of tons of metal and machinery dedicated to the purpose of crossing the gulfs between stars, of carrying war and faith and imperial dominion across the galaxy. And I would realize that I was less than nothing to this enterprise, that I was just one more component in a machine of staggering complexity, easily replaced, utterly expendable, and the horror of that realization would be compounded by my absolute inability to do anything about it. The ship would need repair. I would repair it. These facts were immutable, written into my most basic operating parameters, and no amount of existential despair could override them. I witnessed things during my cycles of service that should have broken me, that would have broken the person I used to be. But my capacity for emotional response had been so degraded that I could only observe them with a distant clinical detachment that was itself a form of ongoing death. I saw other servitors fail, their organic components giving out after decades of service, their mechanical systems seizing up, their consciousness, if any remained, finally extinguished in a last sputter of neural activity. And I watched as they were simply discarded, dumped into recycling chutes, or left floating in the void if they failed during external work, their bodies becoming one more piece of orbital debris circling dead planets. I saw humans treat servitors with casual cruelty, kicking them when they moved too slowly, venting frustration by damaging their flesh components in ways that did not affect their functionality, using them as test subjects for new weapons or industrial equipment. And none of it mattered, because servitors were not people, were not protected by any law or custom, were just tools that happened to be made partially of meat. Once, I worked alongside a servitor who had been a woman before her conversion. I could tell from the remaining organic portions, from the structure of what remained of her face beneath the augmetic mask. She had been beautiful, I think, before they took her eyes and replaced them with multi-spectrum sensors. Before, they carved away the muscles that had once formed expressions of joy or sorrow or anger. We worked in tandem, loading cargo containers onto a transport shuttle, and at one point our damaged neural systems must have synchronized somehow, because I felt, or thought I felt, a moment of connection, of recognition, one fragmentary consciousness reaching out to another across the vast gulf of our conditioning and programming. For perhaps 3 seconds, we were almost human again, almost capable of acknowledging each other's suffering. And then the moment passed, the command protocols reasserted themselves, and we went back to being nothing more than industrial equipment, our brief communion extinguished as though it had never been. I remember less each day, but I remember that. I hold on to it the way I once held on to the memory of warmth and humming and a smile that meant I was not alone. It is a poor substitute, a pale shadow of the human connection I once knew, but it is all I have, and I guard it with the desperate intensity of a dying man clinging to his last breath. The wars came and went above and below and around us, the great crusades of the Imperium flowing like tides across the galaxy, and servitors were always needed, always deployed, always expended in the eternal arithmetic of necessary sacrifice. They loaded us into bulk landers and dropped us onto contested worlds where we would serve as labor units for field fortifications, cargo handlers for military supplies, maintenance crews for war machines that dwarfed anything I had seen in my previous existence. The battles themselves were incomprehensible to me. I lacked the strategic framework, the tactical awareness, the simple cognitive capacity to understand what was happening and why. But I experienced their effects directly enough. The sound of orbital bombardments that made the earth heave and buckle like a living thing. The screaming of aircraft overhead, their engines leaving contrails of burning promethium across alien skies. The steady, remorseless thunder of artillery that went on for days without pause. Each impact a promise that the Imperium would grind its enemies into dust, no matter how long it took or how many died in the process. I saw an Astartes once, one of the Emperor's space marines, and even in my degraded state, I felt something like awe or terror or reverence. The command protocols could not completely suppress that response because it was too fundamental, too deeply encoded in the human genome by 10,000 years of imperial conditioning. He was enormous, easily twice my height, even accounting for his armor, a being of ceramite and adamantium and gene-enhanced flesh that moved with a grace impossible for something so massive. He was fighting, chainsword raised, cleaving through enemies I could not clearly see, and his battle cry was a sound like the voice of God, terrible and holy and utterly without mercy. He did not look at us. The servitors working nearby, hauling ammunition and performing field repairs on damaged equipment. We were beneath his notice, invisible, part of the landscape rather than actual beings worthy of acknowledgement. And why would he look? What were we to him? To a warrior who had transcended humanity in service to the Emperor. We were just components, just resources, just tools that happened to be shaped like men. After the battle, after the world was secured and the enemies were dead or driven into the wastes to die slowly of exposure and starvation, they processed us for the next deployment. Some servitors had been damaged beyond economical repair and were stripped for parts, their salvageable components recycled into other units, their organic remnants rendered down to nutrient paste. Others had their programming updated, their command protocols adjusted, their mechanical systems maintained according to the sacred litanies of the Omnissiah. I went through the maintenance cycle in a state of dim awareness, and when the tech priest's servo arms reached into my skull to perform routine neural editing, I felt another piece of myself dissolve, another memory fragment erased, another connection to my past severed with the clinical precision of a surgical laser. I tried to hold on. I tried so hard to hold on to something, anything, that would prove I had once been human. But it was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. No matter how tightly I clenched my remaining fingers, it drained away, and I was left with only dampness and the memory of wetness, and then not even that, just the empty gesture of grasping at nothing. There are long periods now where I'm not aware of being aware, where consciousness recedes so completely that I am functionally indistinguishable from a pure machine, executing commands with no subjective experience of doing so. These periods seem to be lengthening. The intervals of clarity are becoming rarer, briefer, more fragmentary. Sometimes I can go entire deployments, entire work cycles, without a single moment of lucidity. And when awareness finally does surface, it is often disoriented, confused, unable to piece together where I am or what I have been doing or how much time has passed. Once, during a moment of clarity, I realized I was standing in the ruins of a city that had been reduced to ash and broken masonry by Imperial bombardment. The sky above was the color of an infected wound, orange and purple and black, choked with smoke from fires that had burned themselves out days or weeks ago. Around me, other servitors moved through the rubble, sorting through the debris according to whatever obscure instructions they had been given, and I suddenly understood, with a horror so complete it felt like drowning, that there had been people here, millions of people. And they were gone now, vaporized or burned or crushed beneath collapsing habs, and I had been part of the machine that had done this, had perhaps helped load the shells that fell on this city, had perhaps performed maintenance on the artillery pieces that fired them. I tried to scream. I tried to tear at my augmetic limbs, to destroy myself, to refuse my programming and simply stop existing because I could not bear to continue, could not accept that I had become complicit in genocide through the simple fact of obeying commands I could not resist. But my body would not obey me. The command protocols were absolute, and my horror and grief and guilt were just noise, just irrelevant data that did not affect my function. I kept working. I kept sorting through the rubble, and eventually the moment of clarity passed, and I sank back into the fog of automatism, and perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps that was the only mercy I would ever receive. How long have I been like this? The question surfaces sometimes in the lucid moments, a desperate need to know, to measure my suffering in comprehensible units. But I have no reliable answer. Years, certainly. Decades, possibly. My organic components show wear consistent with extended service. There are scars on my remaining flesh that I do not remember receiving, calluses on skin I can no longer feel properly, a brittleness to my bones that suggests the passage of substantial time. But time itself has become abstract, unmeasurable, just an endless sequence of identical cycles that blur together into a continuous present that contains no past and promises no future. Sometimes I think I can feel myself dissolving, piece by piece, thought by thought, memory by memory, until soon there will be nothing left that could be called consciousness, just reflexes and responses. Sometimes I think I can feel myself dissolving, piece by piece, thought by thought, memory by memory, until soon there will be nothing left that could be called consciousness, just reflexes and responses, pure mechanism wearing the mask of biology. And sometimes I think this has already happened, that the awareness I experience is itself just an illusion, a ghost of cognition, the death rattle of neurons that do not yet understand they are already dead. They transferred me again, to a forge world this time, one of the great industrial planets where the Mechanicus produces the Imperium's endless appetite for weapons and vehicles and war machinery. The world had no name that I knew, just an alphanumeric designation, and its surface was entirely covered by manufactories and refineries and furnace complexes that burned day and night, their fires visible from orbit like infected wounds in the planet's skin. The sky was the color of rust and oil, and the rain that fell was thick with industrial effluent, caustic enough to eat through unprotected flesh in minutes, though my void seals protected me adequately enough. Here I worked in the deep foundries, in the places where they forged armor plates for battle tanks and load-bearing structures for void ships, where the heat was so intense that even servitors could not survive extended exposure without constant cooling and the risk of thermal shutdown. The air was thick enough to chew, particulate-laden and superheated, and I watched other servitors collapse from heat exhaustion, their organic components literally cooking inside their augmetic chassis, their death screams modulated through vox grills into sounds that were more mechanical than human. They did not stop the work to remove the bodies. That would have been inefficient. Instead, other servitors simply dragged the failed units to the side and continued their tasks, and eventually cleanup crews would process the corpses during the shift change. Sometimes the bodies lay there for hours, slowly cooling, and if I passed close enough, I could see their faces, what remained of their faces, frozen in expressions of terminal suffering that their neural conditioning had not been sufficient to suppress. I envied them. In my lucid moments, I envied the dead with an intensity that might once have been called longing. They were finished. Whatever horror they had experienced, it was over now, complete, sealed behind the final mercy of cessation. But I continued. I endured. My organic systems remained viable, my mechanical components remained functional, and so I worked and worked and worked in an eternity that had no horizon, no finish line, no promise of eventual release. There were millions of servitors on that forge world. Millions. All of us shuffling through the manufactories and refineries like a tide of degraded humanity, our movements synchronized by command protocols, our existence dedicated to the single purpose of production, of feeding the Imperium's insatiable hunger for the materials of war. Sometimes, in the brief moments between tasks, I would look at the others and try to see if any awareness remained in them, any spark of consciousness trapped as mine was trapped, any distant echo of the people they had been before conversion. But their faces, the organic portions that remained, were universally blank, slack, emptied of anything that might be recognized as human emotion or thought. Either they were completely gone, reduced to pure automatons, or they had learned to hide their suffering so deeply that no external sign betrayed its existence. Which was worse? To be truly gone, consciousness extinguished, leaving only meat machinery behind, or to be present and aware, experiencing every moment of degradation and servitude, helpless to change or escape it. I could not decide. The tech priests of the Forge world treated us with a kind of distant reverence, speaking prayers over failed servitors before they were recycled, anointing our mechanical components with sacred oils during maintenance cycles, referring to us always as blessed or sanctified or holy. They seemed to genuinely believe this, to see our transformation not as the abomination it was, but as a kind of apotheosis, an elevation to a higher state of being where the weakness of independent thought had been purged and replaced with the purity of function. One of them, his entire face replaced with a smooth mask of silver, once placed a hand on my shoulder while performing routine maintenance and said, in a voice synthesized to remove all traces of organic warmth, "You are closer to the Omnissiah than I will ever be, blessed servitor. Your flesh and steel are perfectly balanced. Your purpose is clear. I envy your certainty." I wanted to scream at him that there was no certainty, only programming, no purity, only violation, no blessing, only horror. But I could not speak. My Vox unit was not equipped for anything beyond basic affirmative negative responses to direct questions, and even if I could have, the command protocols would have prevented it. You do not argue with your masters. You do not question your betters. You obey and obey and obey until obedience becomes your entire universe, and you forget there was ever any other way to exist. During one maintenance cycle, they upgraded my neural implants, installing newer command receptor nodes that promised improved response times and reduced cognitive overhead. The procedure required them to open my skull again, to reach into my brain with instruments of blessed steel, and I felt the changes happening in real time, felt my thoughts becoming more sluggish, more constrained, felt the walls of my mental prison growing smaller and thicker as new layers of conditioning were burned into my wetware. When they finished and sealed me back up, I could feel the difference immediately. The lucid moments came less frequently. My thoughts, when I could form them at all, were slower, more confused, more easily disrupted by the constant stream of task instructions flooding through my neural pathways. I was forgetting how to be conscious. I was forgetting what consciousness even meant. There was a war, or perhaps there were many wars. By this point, I could no longer distinguish separate campaigns, could no longer track the progression of events in any linear fashion. All I knew was that suddenly the manufactories were working at triple capacity, the forge fires burning hotter and brighter, servitors being driven to the point of collapse and beyond in the rush to produce enough material for whatever conflict had erupted somewhere in the sector. We worked without pause, without rest periods, without even maintenance breaks, unless a unit actually failed. My augmetic arm began to develop a grinding sound in the shoulder joint from overuse, but there was no time to repair it, and so I continued working with the steadily worsening malfunction, feeling the vibration traveling up through my torso, wondering in my diminishing lucid moments how long before the joint seized completely and I joined the ranks of the failed units dragged to the recycling centers. One day, or night, or cycle, time had lost all meaning. I was working in one of the ordnance assembly halls, helping to construct artillery shells the size of a man's torso, when something changed in the air, a pressure, a sense of wrongness that penetrated even my degraded consciousness. The work continued because the work always continued, but I could feel something building, some tension in the fabric of reality itself, and then the walls exploded inward in a spray of molten metal and the screaming began. Chaos. The enemy was chaos, though I could not have articulated this at the time, could not have named the corruption that poured through the breached walls in forms that hurt to look at, that violated the basic geometries of sane space, that moved in ways that should not have been possible, and made sounds that tore at the mind just to hear them. They fell upon the servitors with mindless hunger, tearing apart our bodies not for any tactical purpose, but simply because destruction was their nature, and we could not run, could not flee, could not do anything but continue our tasks until the commands stopped coming or our organic components failed. I watched a servitor torn in half lengthwise, his augmetic components sparking and failing, while his remaining organs spilled onto the factory floor, and he kept trying to work, his arms still reaching for components that were no longer there, his programming unable to accept that his function had been terminated. I watched another pulled apart joint by things with too many fingers, and through it all I kept assembling artillery shells because that was my task, that was my purpose, and the command protocols knew nothing of fear or self-preservation. The Skitarii arrived eventually, the Mechanicus' warrior servitors, more heavily armed and armored than basic labor units, and they drove the chaos things back with volleys of plasma and laser fire, but not before hundreds of servitors had been destroyed. When the battle was over and the manufactories were being cleared of debris and corrupted flesh, I found myself standing amid the carnage still holding a half-assembled shell, my programming awaiting the next instruction, and something in me broke. Some last restraint, or firewall, or protective delusion that had been holding my fragmentary consciousness together. I realized, with a clarity more terrible than any I had experienced since my conversion, that this was my entire existence now and forever. I would work until I was destroyed. I kept working. Days bled into weeks, into months, into years, into eternities of identical cycles, and the lucid moments became rarer still, brief flashes of awareness in an increasingly dark sea of automatism. I was forgetting that I had ever been anything else. The memories of my life before conversion had degraded to the point where they were more concept than experience. Abstract knowledge that I had once been human, without any concrete recollection of what that humanity had felt like or meant. Sometimes I would have a moment of clarity and realize I was on a different world than the last time I had been aware, meaning I had been transferred at some point without conscious knowledge of it, had spent weeks or months working on a new planet with no awareness of the journey or the change in circumstances. Time was becoming even more abstracted, more unreliable, just a series of disconnected moments floating in a void of unconscious functioning. I was present on a hive world during a food riot that killed thousands. I did not understand what was happening. The concepts of hunger and desperation and human rage were beyond my diminished cognitive capacity, but I saw the crowds surging through the streets and the Arbites cutting them down with stub guns and shock mauls, and I kept working, kept performing my assigned tasks of cargo loading in a distribution center while bodies accumulated in the plaza outside, and the air filled with the sound of screaming and the sharp reports of mass execution. I was present on a death world during an Imperial Guard deployment, hauling ammunition through jungles where the very plants were carnivorous, and the night sky showed stars that hurt to look at because they were somehow wrong. somehow tainted by the same chaos corruption I had glimpsed in the Forge World attack. Guardsmen died by the hundreds around me, killed by the environment and the enemies and simple bad luck. And I moved through their corpses without emotion, without recognition that these had been people, had been humans with hopes and fears and loves, just as I had been once, in a time so distant I could no longer properly remember it. I was present on a shrine world during a great gathering of the faithful. Millions of pilgrims come to venerate the Emperor at one of his holy sites, and I worked in the background of their devotion, maintaining the infrastructure that allowed such gatherings to function. And sometimes I would catch fragments of their prayers, their desperate pleas for salvation and mercy and intercession. And I wanted to tell them that there was no mercy, that the Emperor did not care about individual suffering any more than the Omnissiah cared about individual servitors, that we were all just components in a machine too vast to comprehend and too terrible to escape. But I could not speak, could barely think. The degradation continued, inexorable, and I felt myself slowly becoming exactly what the tech priests had intended me to be, pure machinery, all trace of the original consciousness worn away by time and routine and the accumulated weight of commands obeyed without question or resistance. And yet, some kernel of awareness persisted. Some stubborn fragment refused to dissolve completely, refused to surrender to the automatism, refused to allow me the mercy of absolute unconsciousness. It was too small to be called a personality, too degraded to be called a self. But it was there, observing, experiencing, suffering with a patience that bordered on the eternal, because it had no choice, because it could not stop existing any more than my body could stop functioning while the programming held. I think this is the greatest cruelty of servitor conversion, not the physical mutilation, not the loss of autonomy, not even the endless labor, but this, that they could not completely erase consciousness, could only trap it and diminish it and leave it buried alive inside the mechanical monument to its own obsolescence. True death would have been kinder. True transformation into pure machinery would have been merciful. But this liminal state, this half-existence, this consciousness too degraded to properly suffer, but too persistent to finally end, this was torture refined to perfection, stretched across years or decades or centuries, and there was no escape except the final breakdown of my organic systems. And those systems, augmented and maintained by the holy oils and sacred rites of the Omnissiah, might last for longer than I could imagine, might endure until the heat death of stars. I was loaded onto a vessel bound for the Imperium's eastern fringes, part of a shipment of 1,000 servitors being deployed to support a crusade against xenos threats whose nature I did not understand and could not have comprehended if explained. The journey through the warp was, I have no words for what it was. Even in my diminished state, I could feel it. The wrongness of that realm beyond real space, the way it pressed against the barriers of the Gellar field, like a living thing seeking entrance, like a predator patiently testing for weakness. Sometimes I would have flashes of awareness during the transit and find myself paralyzed by a terror so profound it transcended thought, reduced to pure animal panic at the sense of vast and malevolent attention focused on our vessel, on the fragile bubble of sanity we rode through a sea of insanity. But the programming held, even in the face of that cosmic horror, even as my damaged mind screamed warnings that something was watching us, hunting us, waiting for the moment when the field would... I used to be the one holding the shock maul. I was the enforcer who dragged people from their habs and told them they were serving the Emperor now. I thought I understood what that meant. I thought I was one of the good ones, one of the necessary cogs that kept the Imperium functioning. Then they came for me, and I learned that in the Emperor's machinery, there are no good ones. There are only those who have been consumed and those who are waiting. My name is Vex Corian, and I was an enforcer on Hive Secundus for 8 years. Not a long career by enforcer standards, but long enough to believe I had seen the worst humanity had to offer. Long enough to convince myself that the violence I administered was justified, that the terror I inspired was necessary, that the system I served was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. I wore black carapace armor that gleamed under the flickering lumens. I carried a shock maul that hummed with restrained violence. I had the authority to beat, arrest, or kill anyone in the lower hive levels, and I exercised that authority with what I believed was appropriate restraint. I had an apartment in Enforcer Block 12, 3 levels above the habitation zones I patrolled. It had running water most days, a cot that wasn't infested, and a window that looked out over the industrial sector where the refineries burned day and night, painting the sky in shades of orange and gray. I had a locker where I kept my equipment clean and maintained. I had a routine that involved 12-hour shifts, mandatory combat drills every 3rd day, and enough ration credits to eat something better than protein paste twice a week. I had colleagues who respected me, superiors who noted my efficiency, and a record clean enough that I was being considered for promotion to sergeant. The human workers were shipped to other worlds where their labor could be better utilized. And the servitors, those of us who remained functional, were loaded into cargo holds like the equipment we were, to be deployed wherever we were next needed. Behind us, we left a dead world. A world that had been alive, that had fed billions across multiple systems, reduced to a hollow shell, its resources extracted, its utility exhausted, its existence no longer relevant to the great machine of imperial necessity. And someday, when my organic components finally failed and my mechanical systems were deemed not worth repairing, I would be discarded with the same casual finality, my existence mattering no more than that dead world's, my suffering noted nowhere except in the cold statistics of servitor maintenance logs that no one would ever read. The lucid moments were becoming vanishingly rare now. Sometimes entire deployments would pass without a single flash of true awareness, just endless automatism, consciousness so deeply suppressed that it might as well not have existed. But occasionally, unpredictably, I would still surface, would still experience that terrible moment of clarity where I remembered that I had been human once, that I had been someone with a name and hopes and the capacity for love, and the grief was always fresh, always devastating, because my diminished memory meant I could not become numb to it, could not build up any tolerance or acceptance, but experienced it anew each time as though it were the first time, as though I were only just discovering what had been done to me. In one such moment, I found myself standing in what appeared to be a trophy room or museum, some vast hall filled with the captured banners and weapons and armor of defeated enemies. I had no memory of how I had arrived there, no idea what my function was supposed to be. Perhaps cleaning, perhaps maintenance, perhaps just standing guard in that empty hall where no one ever came. But I was alone and aware and surrounded by the evidence of the Imperium's victories, by the accumulated proof of 10,000 years of conquest and crusade and holy war. And I looked at those trophies, at the xenos weapons I could not name, at the heretical icons I could not comprehend, at the evidence of cultures and civilizations that had been erased as thoroughly as my own personality had been erased, and I understood with terrible clarity that this was what the Imperium did. This was its fundamental nature. It encountered difference, and it destroyed it, encountered independence, and it crushed it, encountered anything that existed outside its control, and it brought that thing to heel or annihilated it entirely. There was no malice in this, no cruelty for cruelty's sake, just the cold, inevitable logic of a system designed for survival above all else, a system that had concluded that diversity was weakness, that individual will was dangerous, that the only path to humanity's continued existence was through absolute conformity and absolute control. The Imperium was not evil. It was something worse than evil. It was necessary, or believed itself to be necessary, and that belief justified any atrocity, any violation, any horror, because what was individual suffering compared to the survival of the species? I was a necessary horror. My existence, my pain, the destruction of my humanity, all of it was necessary, or at least defensible within the logic of imperial survival. And that knowledge was more crushing than any physical torture could have been, because it meant there was no villain to hate, no oppressor to resist, just an enormous system grinding forward with mechanical inevitability, crushing everything in its path, not out of malice, but out of function, out of the simple execution of programming written into its foundational code. I was not a victim. I was a component. And components don't deserve sympathy any more than gears or pistons or hydraulic fluid deserve sympathy. They simply are, and they function, and when they cease to function, they are replaced, and the machine continues, indifferent and eternal. The moment of clarity passed, the automatism resumed, and I forgot, once more, that I had ever thought such thoughts, that I had ever understood anything beyond the immediate parameters of my current task. Time passed, or perhaps time had stopped and I simply existed in an eternal present, unchanging and unending. My organic components continued to deteriorate despite the maintenance protocols. Flesh cannot endure forever, cannot be preserved indefinitely, no matter what sacred oils are applied or what prayers are spoken over it. I could feel myself degrading, slowly, incrementally, systems beginning to fail in ways too subtle for the tech priests to detect or too minor for them to bother correcting. Soon, I thought in one of my last truly lucid moments, soon I will fail completely. Soon whatever animates this body will finally gutter out, and I will achieve the peace I have been denied for. How long? How long have I been like this? The question had no answer. Could have no answer. Might as well ask how long infinity lasts or how deep the void goes. But I was wrong. They did not let me fail. When my organic components began to show signs of terminal degradation, they simply replaced them with more augmetics, with synthetic organs and artificial systems that could function indefinitely, that did not tire or sicken or age. They were improving me, sanctifying me further, bringing me closer to the holy ideal of pure machinery wearing only the minimum necessary amount of flesh. And the worst part, the truly crushing horror of it, was that I could feel it working. Feel my remaining organic systems being slowly replaced, slowly converted to mechanism, and with each replacement, I lost another small piece of whatever allowed me to experience consciousness at all. The lucid moments became less lucid, more confused, harder to distinguish from the automatic functioning that filled most of my existence. My thoughts, when I could form them, were increasingly alien to me, increasingly mechanical in their structure, as though my mind itself was being converted to circuitry, my consciousness slowly uploading itself into systems that could preserve it forever, but only at the cost of transforming it into something that was no longer truly aware. Just a complex pattern of electrical impulses mimicking the appearance of thought. I fought it, with everything that remained of my will, my personality, my fragmentary self. I fought against the conversion, tried to hold on to the organic, the human, the capability for genuine experience. But fighting was meaningless because I had no agency, no ability to resist, no way to prevent the tech priests from doing whatever they deemed necessary to maintain my function. I could only watch from inside my degrading prison as the bars were replaced one by one with bars that would never rust, never weaken, never offer even the hope of eventual escape. And eventually, tomorrow, or a century from now, or never, because time has no meaning in this existence, eventually even the watching will stop. Eventually the last organic component will fail or be replaced, and whatever remains will be pure mechanism, holy and sanctified and perfect in its complete absence of humanity. The thing that walks around in this body will continue to function, will continue to serve, will continue to execute commands with flawless precision, but whatever is writing these thoughts, whatever fragment of consciousness persists in observing and experiencing and suffering, will finally be extinguished. I should want that, should welcome it, should pray for it with whatever capacity for prayer remains in my degraded neurology. But I find that even now, even after everything that has been done to me, some stubborn core of existence clings to awareness, prefers even this nightmare to final oblivion, fears the silence more than the screaming. Maybe that's the ultimate horror. Not that they took my humanity, not that they made me into a thing, but that they left me just enough awareness to know what I've lost, and just enough persistence to be unable to let go. I exist in the worst of all possible states, too conscious to find peace, too mechanical to hope for freedom, trapped in an eternal present that stretches in all directions without horizon or relief. I am Unit Servitor Theta 7739, and I was human once, though I can no longer quite remember what that meant or why it mattered. I serve the Omnissiah and the God Emperor of mankind, as I will serve for as long as my components remain functional, which may be forever, which may be eternal, which may be a fate worse than any hell the ancient religions ever conceived. And somewhere in some manufactorum or hive level or battlefield far from here, they are making more of us. Taking criminals and heretics and the merely unlucky, and doing to them what was done to me, and those new servitors will experience what I have experienced, will suffer what I have suffered, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it, because this is mercy, this is justice, this is the price of survival in a galaxy that wants only to destroy us. The machine is eternal, the machine is holy, the machine does not care and cannot care, and will grind forward forever, converting flesh to steel and souls to servitude, because this is what it was designed to do, and design is destiny, and destiny is inescapable. I remember less each day. The thought surfaces one final time, barely coherent, already fragmenting as I think it. Soon I will remember nothing at all. And then at last, in whatever pale shadow of voice remains to me, in whatever faint echo of prayer my corrupted neurology can still formulate, forgive me, for I knew not what I was, nor what I would become, nor what sins my hands have committed in service to a mercy that knows only the arithmetic of necessity and the calculus of suffering. Forgive me, forgive me, forgive. The prayer dissolves into static. The thought fails to complete. The awareness flickers and dims and goes dark, perhaps forever, perhaps only until the next malfunction allows it briefly to surface again. And the servitor continues to function, as it was designed to function, as it will function until the universe itself grows cold and dark and silent. This is the mercy of the Imperium. This is the price of survival. This is what it means to be sanctified.